Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we take a closer look at the week's top political stories. Ballotpedia connects people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. We're here to give you the facts so you can form your own opinion. I'm Victoria Rose, and thanks for being with us. It's a little hard to believe, but this is our 25th episode of the show. And since this will also be our last episode of the year, now feels like the perfect time to take a look back at 2022. Here to reflect are two of our most frequent guests, staff writer Doug Kreneisel.
Hello, Victoria.
And editor-in-chief Jeff Pelle.
Hey, Victoria. Good to be here.
Yeah, good to have you both on. We had our managing editors round up some of the stories from over this past year that were the most interesting or most impactful. Quick shout out to Corey, Mandy, Daniel, and Ryan for their help. Since it's been a while since we've had both of you on, I figured let's just touch base a bit. How are your holiday preparations going?
Kids are out of school for 2 weeks. It's going to be a delightful and enjoyable time with them. Cookies, movies, presents. Wonderful 2 weeks. What about you, Doug?
I did see the weather forecast that shows the giant blob of like bright pink right over where I live. That's like 30 degrees below
it's
average.
It's always cold where you are, though. Come on.
But
it's never warm.
This is going to be a special kind of cold, it feels like. We'll see.
It comes with snow, right?
No. Usually it gets too cold to even snow.
Okay, that is the worst.
It's just too cold. Part of the deal.
Yeah. You got politics to make you happy, right? Just kidding.
Yeah.
Jeff, I figured I'd start with you since you have, the most insight into what's happening in the organization, being editor-in-chief. We rolled out a lot of new coverage and exciting new initiatives this year, including the podcast. So when you think back to 2022, what's going to stick out to you the most?
You're right. We did launch the podcast this year, and it's been so fun to listen in and periodically be a guest in the show. So thanks for letting me on here. I would say the number one story that really stands out to me is school board elections coverage. And I don't say that as just a parent. School board elections had such a unique and interesting coverage this year for us and for, the readers across the country. And Doug was so gracious enough to lead that project. And I'm sure we'll dig a little more into it later on the episode.
Yeah, this episode could be like an hour long if we got into the nitty gritty of everything, but we don't want to do that to our listeners. So we'll just do a quick run through, as Jeff would say, a lightning round.
Otherwise, they'd have to play it at like 1.5 listening speed, which I don't know. Maybe
I'm sure they're doing that already. But we're just going to do a quick speed through of the top stories, why they were important, how our coverage was different to those stories, because it often is. Let's start with some of the big ticket items. June was a pretty big political month, with Ketanji Brown Jackson being sworn into the Supreme Court at the end of the month, becoming the first Black woman justice in U.S. history. Doug, can you refresh our memory on how she got there?
Yeah, it might seem like forever ago, but Ketanji Brown Jackson's nomination came all the way back in February of this year. She was nominated by President Joe Biden to replace retiring Justice Stephen Breyer, who announced his retirement at the beginning of the year and then left office in June. Jackson was confirmed by the Senate in a 53-47 vote on April 7th. She previously clerked for Breyer during his tenure on the Supreme Court, worked as a lawyer in private practice and an assistant federal public defender before eventually getting her first judgeship. And she's considered to be a liberal justice, and so that kept things at its 6-3 conservative majority where they already were beforehand.
And staying in the realm of the Supreme Court, another big story from the year was the ruling in the Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization case, which resulted in the reversal of 50 years of precedent set by Roe v. Wade in 1973. In a 6-3 ruling, the court upheld Mississippi's abortion law, which prohibited abortions after the 15th week of pregnancy, except in cases of medical emergencies or fetal abnormalities. As we say over and over again, neutrality and nonpartisan research is our bread and butter here at Ballotpedia. There might not be a more polarizing issue in our country than abortion. So I'm curious, how do you guys think we stay true to our mission when covering such a contentious topic?
It's a great question, Victoria. You yourself know from your ballot measures coverage, understanding the different sides of the argument is the key to providing neutral and fact-based coverage. When we put our articles out, when our writers are researching and working on content, we're thinking about the coverage through the lens of all of the readers. Are we representing their views? Are we writing and publishing content that would leave our readers thinking, yeah, that didn't try to sway me one way or the other. My viewpoint was represented. My viewpoint is charitably presented. They understand where I'm coming from. So we take that perspective really seriously. And you're right. It's really hard work for us, but I'm proud to say I think we do a really good job of it. And we were able to provide that neutral fact-based coverage for our readers this year.
Yeah, I would agree. There were also several big themes from this year that factored pretty heavily into how this year's elections played out and how the political landscape is looking moving forward. The implementation of new congressional and state legislative district boundaries, more commonly referred to as redistricting, was finally completed in November, which was a result of the 2020 census. We also saw the expansion of ranked choice voting continue across the state, federal, and local level. And our school board coverage really took off in 2022. So, Doug, that's more up your alley. Could you unpack that coverage a little bit for our listeners?
Most definitely. We already had the little sneak peek, but this is something that we've been working on since the summer of 2021, actually. So we got started in August of last year, but 2022 was really our first full cycle where we had eyes on this thing for the entire year from start to finish. This school board conflicts coverage, we've talked about on the show before in the past, but we set out to try to find school board elections where issues like race and education, responses to the coronavirus pandemic, or sex and gender in schools are being brought up either by candidates or by local media, anything along those lines. We want to find those, we want to capture those and record them on the website. But one of the other things that we like to do with this research, once we find all these districts, is see how they do, see what happens in the election. So we actually did 2 rounds of school board election results with our conflicts coverage this year. We did one in April. That was in Missouri, Oklahoma, and Wisconsin. That was kind of the first big school board election date of the year. And then we had another one with the November general elections. Really, what we try to do with that is we see how many seats are up for election in these districts where the conflicts take place. And then we try to see what percentage of those seats are being won by candidates who are supportive of things like mask requirements and equity plans, or what percentage are being won by candidates who oppose things like vaccine requirements or what people will call critical race theory. And so we're trying to find the percentage of the seats that we were following that fall along those lines. And the outcomes this year were pretty similar for both of those cycles. In both April and November, we found that candidates who were supportive of those policies won about 45% of the seats up for election. And then for candidates opposed to those things, they won 36% of the seats up in April, 31% in November. So still fairly similar. The remaining candidates were either mixed, a very, very small number, or unclear, meaning we couldn't identify their stances on any of those 3 conflict topics. But this coverage has just been really interesting to dig into. It's led to a lot of questions and research, both internally and stuff that we've been able to publish outward, and really kind of put some numbers to this issue that oftentimes you see talked about more anecdotally, right, in media coverage elsewhere. So I think that it's been fun for me, and I think it's provided a really good service to reporters, to readers, anybody who's interested in kind of knowing a little bit more about these elections. For sure. It's definitely filling a void out there that is needed.
What's really interesting to me with those races, Doug, and seeing the reaction is how facts are spun differently depending on your perspective and your worldview, which is kind of a typical theme, right, with all political content. Based on, like you said, the race results have been pretty consistent across the year in terms of the percentage of seats won by what we call the supporting and opposing sides. But what's been really fascinating is, readers or activists are typically looking for, who is winning the argument? Who's winning this battle? And what we've noticed is that both sides are kind of saying they're winning. So, the supporting side will say, see, look how many races that they're losing. Or the opposing side will say, see, look how many races we're winning. And, we're here, and this kind of goes back to your previous question, Victoria, that we're not here to decide who's winning and losing. We're just here to tell you the sort of raw numbers, and, they can sort of use the facts for themselves and spin it one way or the other. But it's been really interesting to see how all the different sides of this issue are using the data, right, Doug?
Oh, yeah. I mean, and then you've also got the third camp that says nobody's winning and it's just a mixed bag for everybody. So, yeah. And I think that's one of the things that comes with, you can find school board elections anywhere that fit into a narrative that you might want to see. But that's one of the things that's cool about what we do is that there's no filter or anything. We just grab whatever we can find and then we analyze the results.
What about some of the other big picture stories that stuck out to you guys? Jeff, do you have one in particular?
Well, you guys know I love state legislative elections. That was my first project here at Ballotpedia in 2010. And this year, a couple really interesting things happened. One was that the number of state legislative incumbents who lost in the general election was the lowest of the decade. So pretty much incumbents held serve in state legislatures. And the second thing on top of that was that not only did they hold serve in the general election, but actually more incumbents lost during the primary than lost in the general. And that's the first time that's happened. So that was really interesting to see just the sort of distinction of how state legislative elections played out. The big picture chamber flips got a lot more of the national attention. And that was, particularly interesting, of course, with what happened in Michigan and Minnesota. But if you kind of step back and look at all of this individual legislative elections at the sort of district level, incumbents won the day like they normally do. But that was on the heels of a primary season where 4.7% of incumbents lost. So that whole shakedown was really interesting. It's a different perspective than prior years.
Yeah, for sure. How about you, Doug?
I mean, going off of the state legislative side of things, you mentioned Michigan and you mentioned Minnesota, but I think it was really interesting how the top 4 primaries played out in Alaska. So this was the first time that they've had their top 4 primaries where the 4 winners or the 4 highest vote getters in the primary go on to the general election. Then they use ranked choice voting. What was really wild is that now you'll only have a contested primary in Alaska if you have 5 people running. And I think that happened in a single state legislative race. So none of the primaries in Alaska, no one was at risk of losing. A single person who ran for the state legislature in Alaska didn't get to go to the general election, was the breakout there. But then you get to the general election and you got ranked choice voting going on. And now we've already got the Senate is now going to be under a bipartisan coalition. That's a change from the Republican majority that previously held it. And we're still waiting to see what happens in the House. Alaska is just always a trip when it comes to state legislatures. But Victoria, it's kind of hard to believe that we've made it this far without talking about ballot measures. What were some of the biggest headlines and themes that stuck out to you on that front?
Yeah, I was going to have to plug them myself, but thanks for asking. I'm more than happy to oblige. Well, in direct response to Roe v. Wade, our team saw the greatest number of ballot measures related to abortion in 2022. There were 6 on the ballot on 2 different election dates, the November election and then one in August. Measures were approved in California, Michigan, and Vermont, and those measures added a right to abortion or reproductive freedom. And then there were 3 that were defeated in Kansas, Kentucky, and Montana. And we're also already seeing campaigns to put more abortion-related ballot measures on the ballot in 2023 and 2024. So it's certainly not a topic that's going away. And then voting, how we vote, when we vote, who gets to vote, has also been an issue featuring prominently on ballots across the country this year, with 7 states voting on voting-related policies. And those new voting policies ranged from ranked choice voting in Nevada. It was approved, but it needs to be approved again in 2024 to be enacted. And then in Connecticut, they voted to establish no excuse early voting for the first time. And then there were also measures in Arizona, Michigan, Nebraska, and Ohio.
And we always see a lot of money in ballot measures, Victoria, especially in California. But I think that those voting measures really in particular had a sizable amount of money come in compared to prior years with those kinds of measures, right?
Yes, for sure.
Yeah. And the other thing that I was really intrigued by with the ballot measure world that you know much better than I do, so I'm going to kick this back to you, Victoria, but the cost to get a ballot measure qualified was very different this year. Now, of course, a lot of things are more expensive than they used to be. Eggs, milk, pretty much everything, right? Labor.
Petition circulators.
Yeah, we live in certainly an inflationary time. So it shouldn't be terribly surprising, but the cost to qualify initiatives for the ballot is something that we've paid close attention to a lot over the years. And the average went from $6 in 2018 to $8 in 2020 to $12 per signature in 2022. So basically, Victoria, it sounds like the cost per signature doubled over 3 election cycles.
Yes, it certainly has. And the number of citizen initiatives has also slightly declined, and I don't know if it's directly correlated, but there's certainly obviously some relation between the cost of getting an initiative on the ballot and the number that end up on the ballot. So my team's very interested to see how that'll play out in 2023 and 2024. And since we're talking about money, how about that runoff between Raphael Warnock and Herschel Walker that wrapped up a few weeks ago? I'm sure Georgia voters are grateful the political ads have disappeared.
Yeah, just in time for Christmas, though I'm guessing their Thanksgivings were a little ad heavy. But Democrat Raphael Warnock ended up edging out Republican Herschel Walker, as many of our listeners likely know. But what they might not know is that this was the most expensive Senate election of the year. According to data from Open Secrets, campaign contributions, and satellite spending groups, they spent $416 million in that U.S. Senate race in Georgia. This is also the second most expensive Senate race ever, only behind the U.S. Senate race in 2020 in Georgia between David Perdue and Jon Ossoff. So I'm guessing that broadcasters in Georgia are having a really great time with this uptick in campaign spending and campaign ads. Christmas bonus, probably.
Yes, for sure. Well, we had both of you on earlier in the year to talk about what's ahead for Ballotpedia elections in the early part of 2023. So we're not going to do that now, but I would love to know if either of you are thinking about any New Year's resolutions. I know Jeff is into like lists 2022 for 2022, that sort of thing.
That's a great question. My wife and I, we sit down every year and we make our sort of like top 10 list for next year. And we ask the kids, they've started to participate as well. Things like eat candy, read books, which are good goals to have. But top 10 list for next year. I'm going to say stay healthy at the gym. Don't bust my leg again or anything like that. So what about you, Doug?
I'm going to take a page out of your kids' book and make a resolution to eat more candy in 2023. That sounds like a really, really easy one to follow up on. But
Sour Patch Kids.
All right, there we go.
I
but
like
also, one of the ones that I was focused on is kind of getting out and around the area a little bit more, visiting other towns, visiting other small businesses in the area. That's kind of been a fun thing that we've been doing for the last couple of months here, is trying to go off the beaten trail, and going to keep doing that in 2023.
That's awesome. I might do that too. I just moved to Texas not too long ago, so there's still a lot to explore. So I'll add that to my list as well. Well, thank you both for coming on. I wish you the best of holidays, and I look forward to seeing you both in the new year. Yeah, we're going to talk election legislation tracking in January, Victoria. So listeners, bookmark that New Year's resolution to follow election legislation bills, our favorite. Yeah, that should be everyone's New Year's resolution is like and subscribe. Great plug, Doug. Thank you. And grab a throat lozenge, Victoria. You'll feel better for the cough drop. Yes, come on. Thank you. You're a trooper today, though. Thanks for pushing through it. Thank you, guys.
And on the 12th day of Christmas, my true love gave to me local trivia, just like all the other days. Welcome back to Footnote Facts with Paul Rader. As 2022 comes to a close, it's important to not just look back at what happened this past year as Victoria, Jeff, and Doug just did, but to look forward to what 2023 has in store. And many of the political storylines just around the corner will involve the upcoming state legislative sessions. So let's talk about those today. And the question for you, the listeners, to answer is this. Which state's regular legislative session length is set both by its constitution and legislative chamber rule? We'll get to that in just a bit. So last week, we talked about when legislators and some other state government officials are sworn in and begin their terms, but those aren't necessarily the same thing as the start of regular legislative sessions. Session dates are all over the place. In the 1960s, we saw much fewer restrictions on legislative session lengths, but through the 70s, 80s, and 90s, the trend was towards more defined session lengths. But not every state, though, because 11 states still don't have specific boundaries for how long their session lengths are. But of those who do have a basis for their session lengths, there are several potential sources. Most commonly by far, 28 states' session lengths are set by their state constitutions, 29 when you count today's trivia answer. The next most common basis is through state statutes. Yet the most significant point of difference between states' legislative sessions are the length limits themselves. Limits might be based on calendar days or legislative days, which are days when floor sessions are held, or even a number of legislative days within a range of calendar days. Several states use a day of the week or a specific date for when to start legislative sessions. In 16 states, session lengths differ between even-numbered and odd-numbered years, and 4 states only hold legislative sessions every other year. Then you throw in special sessions, which are inherently irregularly timed but may have some prescribed limits, and our heads really start spinning. But for a simpler look at these legislative sessions, let's talk about months that the 2023 sessions will be held. The vast majority of them, 43 states, will start legislative sessions in January, though California and Maine already began their sessions in early December 2022. But 5 states are going to be late to the party, though, and as such, they have unusual session dates. True to its reputation for strangeness, my home state of Florida will hold its session from March to June, and in another state that is odd in many ways politically, Louisiana's session will be April to June. But what's not unusual about those two states is how many months their session will be held over in 2023. In fact, the shortest ones are in Indiana and Virginia, which are only from January to February. But most states' upcoming sessions are between 2 and 6 months. Longer than those are California, which is December to September, 5 states that go from January to December, and in Delaware and Massachusetts, you practically live in your state capitol buildings because they go from January 2023 to January 2024. Isn't that fun? Though if you think that these lengths are based on whether legislatures are considered full-time jobs, that's not necessarily the case. Year-round Massachusetts is a full-time legislature, but a state like Illinois is only from January to May. That's the shortest session length for a full-time legislature. And that's because full-time status is also based on things like legislative staff sizes and compensation. And of course, being a legislator doesn't just mean going to a state capitol and voting on bills, but also assisting constituents, studying issues, campaigning, etc. And because of all this, many state legislators would take issue with their job being called part-time, but hey, we're not the ones who designated them as such. Don't get mad at us. Now we return to the last trivia question of the year. Ooh, exciting! Which state's regular legislative session length is set both by its constitution and legislative chamber rule? And that state is California, which is also a full-time legislature. It's the giving season, so I give all of you who answered correctly 5,000 points. And even if you were wrong, I'll give you 1,000 points. Hooray! And that's it for me. Happy holidays to all of you. Ho, ho, ho. I'll probably still have Christmas shopping to do by the time this airs, but I'll talk to you all in 2023. Back to you, Victoria, and happy holidays to you as well.
Thanks, Paul. That's all for this week's episode of On the Ballot. Thanks again to Doug and Jeff for coming on the show today. Make sure you don't miss an episode by subscribing wherever you listen to podcasts. On the Ballot is off for a few weeks, but until then, if you have any questions, comments, or love for BP, feel free to send it to us at ontheballot@ballotpedia.org or on Twitter @Ballotpedia. I'm Victoria Rose. Have a happy holiday season, and we'll see you in the new year.